Well, as our kids exit, I invite you to turn to the book of Romans. Someone, I will not name them because that just is not good for a pastor to get in the pulpit and start naming people. Bad practice. But someone this morning said, are we still in chapters 13 or are we in 14? I said, well, we're in 9 going into 10. Now, I got to praise this person, right? They said, oh, I've been reading ahead. That's allowed. I want you to know that's allowed. You can go back and read. You can go forward and read. And honestly, you don't have to remember where we are because me and Pastor Clifton and others who preach this summer will remind you. So Romans chapter 9, in a short bit, I'm going to begin reading in verse 30. So that's where we're headed this morning. But the title of this message is When Others Stumble. There's been, Romans is so loaded and there's so many good truths, but every once in a while, I find myself inspired by the writer, Paul the Apostle. When we get a glimpse, not of just his teaching, obviously he's going to teach us this morning, but his heart for people and his heart for the gospel. And this passage is one of those passages that just really caught my attention in terms of how did Paul the Apostle respond when others were stumbling over the gospel? And specifically, and this is, I think, something we can all relate to, specifically when people that we care deeply for stumble over the gospel. And so that's kind of where I'm headed this morning with this passage. But as I was remembering this, I think all of us can identify times in our lives, and maybe this is often, right, when we get around different people, maybe difficult people. Like if we wanted to be real nice about it, we would say it's just there's socially awkward moments in our lives, aren't there? Maybe those moments for you happen at work. Maybe they happen when you travel. Maybe they happen at church. I know that there can be some awkward stuff at church. I know, and I'll just apologize, I know I've made some of you feel very awkward before. I remember first time I came here, I just started hugging guys, and apparently that's not cool for every guy. I'm sorry. In the Midwest, we just, big dudes that love Jesus, we hug each other. So I'm sorry I have given you awkward moments here at church. Maybe those socially awkward moments for you are at home, and please don't look around you at this moment. That could be another socially awkward moment, okay? So we're used to it. I was remembering a time in my life, 12 years old, we loved going to church. That's what we did. And my dad, I did not know this about my dad, but my dad, before he had a family, he was a bus driver for church. He loved doing bus ministry. And so my dad just decided around when I was 11, 12, that what he would do is just start picking up kids and going to church. So we had not a bus van, but we had a 12-passenger van. And I remember the first night he did this. Now, not saying anything against this, right? But I was homeschooled. And the kids he was picking up were not homeschooled. And I remember my dad picked up a bunch of these kids, and then he came back to pick up his children. And I get in the van, and I'm like, who are these people? It was immensely socially awkward. I mean, they were using words I'd never heard before. I wasn't even sure how to communicate, right? It was just really awkward. And I remember within the first minute, I'm sitting in the front bench and a boy's already in trouble. My dad says, hey, you need to come up and sit by Johnny. I'm like, Dad, this is not the way to make friends like you do. And I didn't even know I was in trouble. I was in the trouble seat first thing. I mean, this was just immensely socially awkward. I had no idea how to engage people. And we've all felt those moments. But often, those awkward moments get really amplified when our faith gets somehow a part of the relationship. Every once in a while, it's like everything's cool, but you know what? As soon as faith is mentioned, or church is mentioned, or the Bible is mentioned, all of a sudden there is a tension, am I right? And so I'm speaking to believers, but I'm going to have some words in here. If you're here this morning and you're not a follower of Jesus Christ, I want you to know you're very welcome. And I do have some words to share with you this morning from this passage. But Paul understood the tension that a follower of Jesus Christ has in relationships when faith really seems to cause friction. And so let's read this passage, and I'm going to show you, right, or like how Paul can relate to what we feel. And more importantly, what does Paul do with that? So Romans chapter 9, beginning reading in verse 30, and I'm going to go down through chapter 10, verse 4. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That is, a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Lord, please, may your Spirit speak through your word, this passage this morning. Amen. In Romans chapter 9, and verse 30 through 33, if you're taking notes, this is what I see as the believer's struggle, okay? Paul is bringing together, and he's giving a beautiful summary of some of what he's taught in chapter 9 and reminding us of stuff that we talked about in chapters 4 of Romans, and you could add that to the extra reading if you want. When he says this, he says that the Jews who were trying to gain righteousness just by following the law, by works, it didn't work because they didn't do that by faith. They didn't do that by faith. An incredible little summary verse. We've talked so much about that truth, that you can't, I can't, no one back then could work their way, perform their way to salvation. It wouldn't work. And we look around and we try to measure ourselves up, but we all fall short. It's only through faith that we experience salvation. So an incredible summary of that truth that Paul gives. But the struggle that Paul faced, that it's very similar to how you and I face, is one, we don't get to pick our community, do we? We don't get to pick the people around us. We sometimes work really hard at it, but every time we have to go out or every time that we are around any people, we don't get to dictate who's around us. Paul describes both Jews and Gentiles, and again, following this series, the church had both. People from very different backgrounds, people with very different values coming to faith in Jesus Christ. You know, for the follower of Jesus Christ, the person who loves Jesus, you really don't get to pick your community. Like, has anyone other than me ever found out that if you're following Jesus, he puts you in awkward positions, right? And I think that's just because he wants us to rely on him, but it's also because he's wanting to work in and through us at the same time. So there's no following Jesus and being comfortable all the time. Like, if that's you, I would love that story, okay? Just come and talk to me, because I've not heard that story yet, if that's you. But I think they just can't go together. There's moments of comfort, and we find incredible peace and comfort in him. But in our circumstances, in our community, with the people that God puts in front of us, there's going to be awkwardness. So there was all this awkwardness in terms of different backgrounds in the church, and also there were different responses to the truth of Jesus Christ. You had people receiving him, both Jews and Gentiles. You had people rejecting the person of Jesus Christ, both Jews and Gentiles. So you had these different responses to faith. And so here's part of that struggle. We don't get to pick our community, but more than that, and this is where I really want to get to this morning and think about, is often those that are closest to us reject what is most central in our hearts. Again, and I'm speaking to the follower of Jesus Christ. If you follow Jesus Christ, you know and you love him, you know how important that is to you. I mean, it gets up there with kind of oxygen, right? Like you can't imagine life without Jesus. He's so important. He's a part of everything. But then there's these people that mean so much to you. Best friends, immediate family, close family, parents, colleagues, and you've spent time with them. They mean something to you, and yet Jesus seems to mean nothing to them. And the reason I think Paul is having this is why he's feeling this as he writes this is I want to take you back to the beginning of chapter 9, verses 2 and 3. Pastor Clifton shared these verses with us 2 weeks ago. Here's Paul opening up this chapter, and he says that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. Does that sound like someone who really, is kind of, well, I care, but I don't care. Like I'm genuinely slightly bothered that you don't know Jesus? No, this was crushing to Paul that what he describes as his brothers in the flesh, the Jews, had rejected Christ. Verse 3, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. Paul had a very deep care in his heart for his brothers according to the flesh, who he is writing about. So I'm talking about your relationship to people you love very much that don't know Jesus Christ and what that does in your heart. I think Paul, who is writing this, is right there with you. He understands what this feels like and works like. That which is closest to our hearts. Take a look at verse 32, that which is central. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith. There's that faith. The faith is central. The message of hope that we are reading about throughout Romans, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news. Paul says this is central, but this message of hope, the message that would take away shame. Look at verse 33, quoting from Isaiah, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. We know what shame feels like. And honestly, oftentimes we see its existence and its impact in the lives of those we care very much for. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we're like, you don't need to feel that. You don't need to live with that shame. Jesus will rescue you from that shame. And they stumble over that message. It is a stumbling block to them. Now, again, I promise if you're here not a follower of Jesus Christ, again, glad you're here. I just a word to you, like I got a couple of things I want to share with you. I know that sometimes when people talk to you about Jesus, it can be a little abrasive. Or you might call it, words that I've heard is you're kind of pushy. You're kind of pushy. It's kind of abrupt. You maybe a little too passionate, right? Like you just feel attacked by someone trying to tell you about Jesus, and I understand that. I understand that. And let me say this too. There's never a space, and I'm going to come back to this for the believer at the end of the message. There's never a space for someone to be unkind to you just because they're telling you something that's true, right? There's no space for that. Jesus didn't do that. He was both loving and kind and truthful always. And so we're gonna get back to that. But you may have felt that you weren't loved. Someone's talking to you about Jesus, and it just wasn't loving. And I want to challenge you. that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't true. And it definitely doesn't mean that you should never listen or hear again. And if you're watching this message, I'm assuming it's because you still have interest. So I just wanted to say that with you. But getting back to the follower of Jesus Christ, you know what? I know what we're left with when we have Jesus who means everything to us, and we have people who mean a lot to us, but Jesus means nothing to them. Our hearts are left broken. Our hearts are left broken. And it's kind of like, what do we do with that? And so let's look at chapter 10 because I love Paul's response. So we've seen the believer's struggle. Now I want to look at the believer's heart, Paul's heart in verse 1. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. The believer's heart, number one, is centered on the gospel. He says, this is my heart's desire. Heart meaning like life. This is my existence, the desire of my existence. This is what brings me happiness, is the gospel, that they may be saved. Number one on my list is that they would come to faith in Jesus Christ. What an incredible heart. And as I sat back and thought about that, as followers of Jesus Christ, we would all go, well, yeah, I'm with that. I'm on that. But I thought to myself, I'm like, okay, but sometimes I'm not like all with that. So what is that? I'm probably confusing you. I confuse myself sometimes. God has to straighten me out. This is what we do. We want them to be saved, but we tie something to it. Right? Follow me. We think, and maybe we don't say this, but we think, I want them to be saved so they will stop. And you might even have a list. They need to stop this, and they need to stop this, and they need to stop this. And if Jesus would get a hold of them, things would be a lot better, right? And so maybe that's you. I like the awkward laughters from time to time. I want them to be saved so that they will start. My husband needs to get going on this and that and this and, right? Whoever it is, right? Like, they need to start doing this. I want them to be saved so we can do this and that together and that, right? Like, we add something. And I'm not saying those things are wrong, but I think sometimes our hearts can be a little sneaky, right? How about I want them to be saved so they will agree with me on this issue? See, the reason why you disagree with me on an issue is because you don't got Jesus. You get some Jesus in you, then you'll agree with me. I think sometimes our hearts are sneaky that way. Paul doesn't have any of that. Are all those things good? Sure, all those things could be very, very good. I'm sure you can see very clearly what would be good in someone else's life. I'm not questioning that. But what I'm saying is, when the gospel is centered, when our heart's desire is that they may be saved, period. That's what I want for them. And what God does with their life following that, praise be to him. I don't need to dictate. I'm not after something else, God. I want them to know you. That is hard. One of the things that I like to say is, okay, what would be the opposite? God, would I be okay? God, would I be happy? Let me put it that way. Would I be happy if they were saved and yet they didn't do the things that I want them doing? Would that be okay, God? And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm saying that's a great way to test your heart. That's a great way to test your heart. Here's how a heart centered on the gospel is evidenced. What is it evidenced by? We see it in the passage. 1, praying. Verse 1, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer. How are we praying for these people that we love? Again, substitutes that we have sometimes is, well, I'm angry at them. Is that the same? Is that the same as praying? Maybe I'm not angry at them, but I'm angry about them. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I've prayed somewhat angry to God because someone isn't saved, right? Just being real with you. So, anger. Is worry the same as prayer? Because if worry is the same as prayer, I am a prayer warrior, right? Worry is not the same. Praying. A heart centered on the gospel is evidenced by praying, asking God's best for them that they may know him. Praying. And we have so much content about what that should look like. But are we praying? Acknowledging the good. I love what Paul does here. In verse 2, he says, "For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God." Every once in a while, I might get with a believer, and it seems that they have a difficult time praising someone. Even when there's a praise, it's kind of tied with, if I wish that only they would. You know what? You can talk good about people. Paul says, I see that they have a zeal. I think this is good. Sometimes we just need to speak well of people. I'm not talking about lying. I'm not talking about stretching the truth. I'm just saying identify what's good. Identify what's good. This is good in your relationships. Acknowledge the good. And then speaking the truth. And we're going to come to what the truth is. Speaking the truth. And that's in verse 2 as well. "For I bear them witness." I testify to them. I talk to them. This is a heart centered on the gospel is going to communicate to those they love, and in that communication is going to be the person of Jesus Christ. And it takes a lot of wisdom and a lot of the Spirit's guidance to know how that looks. So I want to pause, and I want you to ask yourself a couple of questions. I want you to ask yourself a couple of questions at this moment. One, what is my heart towards those who are stumbling over the gospel? Is it frustration? Is it impatience? These are things that come up in me. Is it passivity? Like you care about them, but it's just there's so much tension because you want them to know Jesus that you just can't really spend that much time with them. I don't know. What is your heart? Is your heart centered on the gospel for them? What is your heart towards them? And then the second part of this is, how is that heart evidenced in my life? I love to ask a question, right? So if my heart is centered on the gospel for these people that mean so much to me, would anyone else know that? Is there any evidence of that in my life? Paul, there could be other evidences, but Paul prayed, he spoke well of them, and he spoke to them of the gospel. I mean, that's just in this one passage. You look at all of Romans, so much that he did. How is my heart being centered on the gospel evidenced in my life? How would they know that? Some questions for you to think about. Getting back to the passage, Romans chapter 10, verses 3 through 4. Again, the last point was speaking the truth. What is that truth? Here we see in verses 3 and 4, the believer's message. Paul says, "For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." That last verse, verse 4, something that Paul has stated over and over and over and over again. And why does he do that? Because we need to hear it over and over and over and over again. Christ is it. Christ is the gospel. The believer's message, what is our message to them? And I'm not saying you go and quote this. That may not work really well, okay, in a relationship where there's already some faith tension. But here is, I think, the core of it. One, you, meaning the person stumbling over the gospel, you are seeking to establish your own righteousness. That was true of every single one of us, either now or before salvation. Another way of saying it is like, there's a couple ways of saying it. We were trying to show others or convince ourselves that we were right or okay or at least better than most. Like that's what we were doing. And we still fall into that some days. Still slide into that. Like, I'm seeking to establish my own righteousness. And whatever, if you thought of the people, again, that you care a lot about and you're wanting them to know Jesus, in one way or another, you can see how they're trying to establish their own righteousness. Their conversations with you are either, to defeat what you're saying or to justify what they're doing. Some mix of that, right? They're seeking to establish their own righteousness. What's the second part of that? And it's hard for us to admit that. What's the second part of that? You are not submitting to God's righteousness. The word submitting there is, you think of the gospel. The gospel is just saying, Lord, I receive your free gift of salvation. I put my faith and trust in you. Before I can say that, I need to recognize that I need salvation, that I can't do it on my own. That's submission. That's humility. That's saying, I need you. And that is so hard for you and me to say some days. And that is so hard for the people that we love to say. But that is the message. You're seeking to establish your own righteousness, and you are not submitting to God's righteousness. Now, how we communicate that message is so important. Again, I talked kind of earlier in the message to people who are not ready to go all in on the person of Jesus Christ and said, I know someone's talked to you, and it turned you off big time. You just kind of backed away from a lot. You're like, I didn't know this was an interrogation. I thought we were having coffee. I don't know what it looked, you just felt all of a sudden like, I need to just, you know what, I'm just not answering those texts for a while. Like, I just need some space. I understand that. So what should be our approach? And I think both believer and non-believer would benefit from this approach, but let's see it. Let's see it. One, again, we need to testify and bear witness. We don't back away from the truth. That's different than being aggressive with the truth. I'm saying we don't back away from the truth. You remember at the beginning of this study, there's a wonderful verse, Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. I'm not going to back away from it. I'm not going to, say, well, this relationship is so important that I'm just not going to talk about Jesus. Or I'm not going to do anything that comes close to identifying Jesus as important to me. Right? And I know I'm not getting into details about how this works because honestly, we need Christ's direction in these relationships. But we never sacrifice the gospel in our lives in relationship to someone else. We don't do that. We don't back away. Paul said, I bear them witness. These are people who have already rejected Christ. Some of these people were there when he was crucified. Some of these people were actively seeking out and imprisoning followers of Jesus Christ. And Paul says, I bear them witness. I bear them witness. But how he does that, so we don't back away from the gospel, but we also do not abandon the heart of the believer. What we just talked about, chapter 9, 2 and 3, where Paul says, I do anything. I do anything because I love these people so much. Chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, my heart's desire in prayer. We don't back away from the truth, but we never abandon our love for them. One verse that I have absolutely loved and continues to resonate in my life is Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 15. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 15 says, rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head. And this is something that is just, you see it in Christ's life over and over and over again, and it's really written in different ways. To me, this is just the most powerful summary of that. Speaking the truth in love. So important. This is what I see us do from time to time, is we go either from one extreme to another. Some of us Some of us, we think in order to speak the truth, we have to kind of let go of love for a moment, get really serious because we have something important to say, step over, and all of a sudden, this is me, this is confession. All of a sudden, we just let it out, right? We give him the truth. And then we end up apologizing, and we did, like that happens. We step away from love in order to speak the truth. The other extreme, and maybe this is true of some of you, is we go, well, I just need to love them. And that's absolutely true. We do need to love them. But we never talk about Jesus Christ. We never talk about our faith. We never even insinuate it because we don't want to make them upset. That's not right either. But speaking the truth in love. Verse 14 in Ephesians chapter 4 gives us a picture of kind of what the world looks like related to this. It says, so that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness in deceitful schemes. Anyone ever feel like you catch that some days? Deceitfulness, schemes, deceiving, all those things. Like that seems to be a lot in our culture today. That may feel like that's a lot in your workplace. That may even feel like it's in your family a lot. You're never really quite sure what's true or real or what did happen because of all of this deception. We are called to something completely different. Speaking the truth in love. So here's another question for you. Question just for you to reflect on. Is my tendency to back away from speaking the truth or to move away from compassion when talking about Jesus? I think that we all have a tendency. I'm not saying like my tendency is to let go of compassion and, speak the truth. And that's wrong. But what's your tendency? I think we all have a tendency on that spectrum. And it takes prayer, and it takes the Spirit's working in our lives to be balanced. And Jesus is our perfect example of that. Speaking the truth in love. Come back to the person who's not a follower of Jesus Christ. I know some of you have been told, like capital letters about Jesus and your need for salvation. It turned you off big time. Listen, it was true. There was still truth in what was said. If they were talking about Jesus Christ and your need for salvation, it was true. Because we all need salvation. We all need Christ in our lives. But I understand you didn't feel loved. I want you to feel loved. And my desire, I think, is the same as Paul's. I want you to feel loved, but I want you to experience the perfect love of Jesus Christ. I want that for you. Others, and I've known this. I don't know who's here. I have no idea, or who's going to watch this later. Others, they feel very loved, and they still reject the truth of Jesus Christ. Why is that? Why is that? Next week, invitation to believer, non-believer. You're a believer, next week, incredible opportunity that we're going to share the gospel. Check this out. I'm giving you a little preview. Those of you who like to read ahead, I'm doing it with you, so apparently it's okay. Romans 10:9, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Come back next week. That's going to be a wonderful passage for us to look at together. You will be saved. What incredible truth. If you're here and maybe you've heard it, but you need to hear that truth, that gospel again, come back next Sunday. We'd love to share that truth with you from that passage. So, believer, I'm going to enter into a time of prayer. And I know that there's people you care a lot for. And there's something else I want to say. If you're here and you're like, actually, I don't know of anyone I care a lot about who doesn't know Jesus, there's another issue, okay? Because again, God will always put those people in your life. So this is the question. If You know those people, and you know how your heart's breaking. So here's the prayer that I invite you to pray in your heart, out loud. God, you know my heart. You know my heart for those I love that do not know you. Help me to speak the truth to them in love. And it may be this morning, and don't do this out loud, but it may be this morning that there's some names that are just heavy in you. And you need to, not out loud, but you need to, in your heart, in your mind, pray those out. God, you know my heart for, and this one, and this one, and this person. God, you know my heart for them. You need to name them. Not out loud, but to God. Just name them and say, help me to speak the truth to them in love. Help me to speak the truth to them in love. Or it may just be enough for you to pray this out loud, but I invite all of us who are followers of Jesus Christ, who God has put people in our lives that we know and we love, but they don't know him, to pray this or something like this morning. Because I believe this week, God's going to give us opportunities to speak the truth to them in love, and we need his help to do it. Can't do it. Can't do it on our own. We just fall into one of those tendencies. We let go of the truth or we let go of love. We need his help to do both. So let us bow our heads, close our eyes. Please pray as God leads you. And I will close our time of prayer in a short while. Father in heaven, you know every heart. And so I pray for the hearts in love with you and in love with the people who do not know you that are in their lives. I pray that you help them to speak the truth to them in love. And God, we will continue to honor and praise and give you all the glory for every life that is rescued and enters into an eternal relationship with you. We will praise you for that, and we praise you for your faithfulness and all that you have done. So may we go from this place with wisdom, knowing what that needs to look like, and courage also to do it. In your name, amen.